Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Carolina Kazlaskady. Oh, do we have a hand? Okay.
I was just waving.
Okay, cool. My name is Carolina Kazlaskady. I am wrapping up my third year in my clinical psychology doctoral program. So a little bit about me. I currently do research that focuses primarily on alcohol use in college students. Clinically, I've worked in multiple different settings, including currently the counseling center at William and Mary, as well as the Hampton Roads VA, which is where I became interested in working with veterans in the future. So my experiences there are pretty much what led me to be interested in working with veterans, specifically like addressing mental health needs in families and spouses. And I worked with a lot of things like trauma, substance use, depression, anxiety, difficulty with relationships, those sorts of things. So this presentation today was developed in conjunction with Charlie Foster and Brandon Parker, who is a master's in counseling student. You may know him. And in addition to Dr. Ali Papas Burdaj is here today. She's overseeing this. She's a clinical psychologist that works at William and Mary, so she may pop in as well if she has any sort of input or any thoughts. So with that being said, this presentation is geared towards student veterans and also their families and any other dependents. So the idea here is to really understand more about student veteran mental health, and not just necessarily for you, but maybe for a loved one or a friend, or maybe even your own child or your spouse, and sort of understanding the different factors that can lead to mental health difficulties in people. Again, we'll be recording the session, so in case there's anything that you'd like to revisit, we intend to post it somewhere so that there's access to that in the future. So I'd love to start us off with a brief true or false. You don't have to actually formally answer anything in the chat or unmute or anything. This is more so just like a personal reflection. Okay. True or false? Mental health conditions happen but are relatively uncommon. 1 in 100 people are affected by mental illness in the US. Okay, so this is actually false. In a given year, research from the National Institute of Health says that 1 in 4 Americans suffer from a mental health illness, and that is just in a given year. So any time point within the span of a year. Across someone's lifetime, research shows that nearly half of Americans will experience a diagnosable condition. So those stats are pretty surprising and pretty significant and really highlight the need for mental health treatment. True or false? You can go to therapy even if you don't have a diagnosable mental illness. That is true. Therapy can help people get through not just diagnosed mental health conditions, but also different challenging life events. Things like improving communications and relationships, engaging in healthier habits like exercise, sleep, emotion regulation, those sorts of things. And so you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosed condition formally to go to therapy. There are some caveats where some sites will require some, like for example, the VA, because they are billing insurance, they're required to submit a diagnosis for insurance, but that's not necessarily the same thing as um, you are required to have something significant and severe before you go into therapy. And if you do have ever questions about that, you could always ask your provider about if this is a site that diagnoses and what the diagnosis that they are considering might be. You are well within your right to have that conversation with your provider. So this is just a brief psychology today self-assessment, and the idea here is focused on just how you're feeling today, and you'll see here that it sort of reveals. I don't think you can see the screen, so let me edit that. Let's see. Is that visible? Cool. You'll see here that it's not necessarily we're talking about significant symptoms, but more so some things that you may be experiencing. So I'll just walk through a couple of these. For example, feeling overwhelmed by your emotions, handling stress at a level, handling the stress that you experience, physical symptoms of anxiety, strong relationships, feeling good about the choices I've made in my life, being self-critical, engaging in negative self-talk. So all of these are sorts of things that you might be able to target in therapy. Maybe you find yourself being really critical towards yourself or harsh on yourself, and that's something you might want to work on. That could be something that could be helpful to work on there. So let me go back to the presentation. Okay. Okay. True or false? Mental health problems are permanent. All right, it depends. That's a trick question. So, for the most part, some people may experience sort of um, like chronic conditions or chronic symptoms of their diagnosable condition. Sometimes it'll fluctuate over time, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily permanent. So chronic and permanent are not entirely the same. We know that treatment is known to be effective to help, and for some people, they may experience like an episode here or there that sort of like are scattered throughout their lives. Some people might struggle but learn to cope in better ways. And also, different people have different understandings of what recovery is to them. So it's kind of hard to answer this question, but I do think it's important to acknowledge. Um, and this last piece, true or false, having a mental health condition and going to therapy is a sign of weakness. People should just tough it out. All right, that is false. So this is no more true than saying that someone who broke their bone or has or got a cold or has psoriasis is weak for doing for having one of those conditions. People don't choose whether or not they have a mental health condition. So in fact, sometimes acknowledging one's difficulty and one's and reaching out for support requires a lot of vulnerability and strength and can be really difficult for us to do. So akin to physical health, going to therapy can be really similar to how everyone can take active steps in improving their physical health. So it's sort of similar to physical health in some ways. And it can help to sort of think about it in that way. So, with this being said, when we talk about people don't choose to have a mental health condition, so what exactly goes into what causes mental health challenges? In psychology, we often call this the biopsychosocial model. What it's saying is that there's biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors that all sort of overlap to increase risk. And certain things, for example, like bipolar disorder or depression, may be at higher, like there's a lot of research that shows that it might be more linked to biology. And certain other things may be social, for example, or environmental, like trauma. And so typically, the way that we understand it is that it's a combination of different things. So, what about student veterans specifically? When it comes to student mental health, one study found that student veterans have increased rates of mental health challenges. So, the study found that compared to non-student veterans, student veterans have up to 1.7 to 2.4 times more likely to screen positive for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. And of these people, only a little under half receive treatment. So there's a clear discrepancy here between those who may be in need and may be struggling versus those who are actually able to get to treatment. And data from the 2024 Government Accountability Office report on student veterans also shows that most of the treatment that occurred among student veterans across VAs, most of them sought treatment for mental rather than physical challenges. So there's some evidence here that speaks to the need amongst veterans and also potentially the increasing openness to treating mental health challenges. And so many student veterans also experience symptoms. One study found that 35% of their sample of student veterans experienced severe anxiety, 24% with severe depression, 46% experienced significant symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and 46% experienced suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide. So those are pretty high numbers and pretty high rates of distress that our student veterans are reporting. And some of these are, this is just to highlight some of the common struggles or diagnoses that individual or student veterans may experience. So there's post-traumatic stress disorder, which may look like avoidance of places, people, or situations that remind someone of an event. Really strong negative reactions, like maybe feeling really irritable or very like angry and sort of outbursts in a sense. Feelings of detachment, experiencing flashbacks or nightmares. There's also traumatic brain injury, which can lead to memory and concentration problems, mood swings, depression, anxiety. Military sexual trauma, which is defined as sexual assault and repeated sexual harassment during service. And a large proportion of women and 4.2% of men report experiencing sexual assault during military service. And this can often lead to PTSD, although it doesn't necessarily have to. But it can obviously impair mental functioning. So moral injury among veterans is the impact of events or acts which conflict with their own values or their own belief systems. And so oftentimes this can occur when someone does something that they didn't feel like was right, or maybe they felt like they were just following orders, or they are sort of having trouble balancing the two pieces of what it was like to be in the military and maybe who they are as a person. This can co-occur with PTSD, but it, again, doesn't necessarily have to. It's more so a focus on violation of your values. And this can lead to feelings of guilt, shame, disgust, anger, difficulty forgiving yourself, and engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors. What we mean by that could be like lots of drinking or self-harm, something like that. And I also wanted to highlight suicidal ideation. So, suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide is really common and often difficult to talk about for many people. Oftentimes, we have ourselves been touched by suicide in some way with our families or loved ones. And so passive ideation is considered like this involves a wish to die, but without any actual intent or plan. So it's sort of the idea of like, I would be better off dead, or I wish I could go to sleep and never wake up, or I don't want to do this anymore. Oftentimes people aren't realizing that when we have those thoughts, that is passive suicidal ideation. There's also active ideation, which involves like an actual intent, plan, or method. So that's when you are actually considering dying by suicide. Um, so there are some myths that talking about suicide will put the thought into someone's head, but research doesn't support that at all. If anything, talking about it provides relief. By opening up the conversation, the person tends to report feeling less alone, less isolated. It opens up the pathway for treatment. And there's also a lot of myths that people who talk about it don't actually mean it. And our research shows that that's also not really the case. When people talk about it, that's actually quite a big warning sign. And so it's important to for people who talk about it to take them seriously. And again, suicidal thoughts can affect anyone, so you don't even have to be diagnosed with a mental health condition. Suicidal thoughts can come from life crises like divorce or relationship troubles or trauma or even legal challenges. I've included the crisis lifeline number at the bottom there just in case that's something that you'd like to write down or have access to, given that we're talking about a sensitive topic. So student veterans specifically, compared to non-student veterans and compared to non-veteran college students, face additional stressors, these two intersecting identities of veteran and student. Specifically, first, there's a shift from structure to less or no structure. So veterans might feel like they are unsupported during the reintegration into civilian life. They may feel like there's not enough, like I just went from having a rigid routine every day to having all this free time where I'm expected to impose this routine onto myself. There's also different cultural differences between civilian and military lifestyle. So that may feel like the structured versus like the independence that we spoke just now about, like the hierarchy versus something more egalitarian where there's less hierarchy. That may also be a struggle to shift into. And also lots of teamwork versus lots of individualism when you're outside of the military. And so all of those are cultural differences that have an impact on us mentally when we're trying to acculturate to civilian life. This also includes reintegrating into family life. So, you may have new or pre-existing roles or responsibilities within the family, and that takes a heavy burden on you if that's not something that you've been used to for a while. Financial difficulties are something that lots of student veterans endorse, specifically finding and paying for housing and paying off student loans. And of course, physical and mental health difficulties, especially ones that may not go recognized, whether they're not diagnosed or whether they're not treated, or whether the Office of Disability at the university is not aware of those diagnoses. Um, there's an additional layer of complications there. And also there's many student veterans report feeling disconnected from their younger peers and from their faculty, especially given that lots of student veterans have experienced working with lots of like managing personnel, managing equipment, systems, budgets, and they may have had significant responsibilities that they may feel that their college student counterparts can't relate to. And so all of these combined can sort of add additional layers of stress and pressure on our student veterans. William and Mary students specifically have endorsed, or William and Mary student vets specifically have 66% described their transition as difficult or very difficult. 55% needed time to figure things out. 50% described lacking a sense of purpose as they transition from the military. And 44% reported feeling unprepared to navigate the transition to their civilian career. So clearly, there's a lot of need of sort of feeling like you're on unstable footing. And that's really common and can feel like unstable. So there's definitely more impact on families too here. So military parents with mental health challenges are more likely to experience relationship problems within the family. And children of military parents with PTSD are at higher risk of developing emotional and behavioral problems themselves. So, unfortunately, some of this stress and some of this pressure that student veterans may feel can sort of leach out into the family dynamic. Military spouses of those with mental health difficulties report higher levels of caregiver burden, stress, and their own mental health issues, which can also impact parenting abilities and marital satisfaction between the veteran and their partner. So it sort of has this sort of feedback loop type of reaction where someone is struggling and it creates greater struggles in the family. And then that creates the individual to struggle even more. So that's another possibility. So, some more research on military spouses. This is from the 2021 Military Family Lifestyle Survey. Amongst military spouses specifically, 25% reported a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. That is much higher than the civilian population and definitely a significant concern. A lot of the reasons is has been highlighted for like unstable feelings of instability, essentially, of like my partner is leaving and coming back and being deployed and coming back. And even when you are a veteran and you are like essentially stationary and hoping that things are now stable, there can also, of course, be shifts and different roles that you might have to take on. So lots of feelings of instability that have been reported. 5% military spouses endorsed considering suicide in the past year. Only 41% said they got enough quality sleep. Less than 20% felt they belonged to their spouse's unit or command spouse group. So there's this sense of like lack of community or maybe lack of connectedness with others. 10% experience unhealthy relationship behaviors, so jealousy, control, or threats, and that is twice the national rate. So definitely another thing that sort of indicates that there might be stress or feelings of overwhelm in the household. And many spouses didn't report issues because of a fear of impacting the service member's career or fear of embarrassment. So they want to sort of not cause any sort of trouble, right? And that can also just sort of let that those emotions or that overwhelm sort of fester without it actually being addressed or getting better. So what about kids? Military teens defined as children or adolescents of those whose parents serve or have served in the military. The 2022 Military Teen Experience Survey found that less than 10% of military teens surveyed indicated a high level of mental well-being. So very few felt that they were mentally well. 28% reported low mental well-being and 63 indicated moderate well-being. 37% endorsed considering harming themselves or others. It's a quite large number. One in three military teens endorsed harming themselves or others, which is definitely a risk for concern. From the clinical perspective, it sort of speaks to lots of internal pain. There's something going on there for sure. 25% sought care for their mental health, so less treatment seeking than maybe people may need. And 10% did not disclose their mental health concerns to their parent or guardians. They reported that they were sort of afraid of how their parent might react, or reported that they worried that their parent might not believe them or might sort of like wave it off. So they just sort of kept it to themselves, which a lot of research shows that when we sort of keep these things to ourselves, it can make things worse over time. Um, so what is getting in the way? What gets in the way of stopping people from reaching out and um yeah, and going to treatment? A big piece is cultural factors. So a fear of stigma, a fear of career repercussions. What will this mean if I go to treatment, if I get a diagnosis? What does that mean for me? A distrust of medical systems too. So not trusting medication providers, not trusting the effectiveness of treatment. Does it actually work? Being sort of skeptical towards that. And definitely self-reliance. I highlight that because that's so common amongst military populations. Participants often, or not participants, from this study, participants described an aversion to help, or a tendency to rely on individual will to persevere. So while that's very honorable and wonderful and a really strong value in so many ways, sometimes it can sort of get in the way where it can limit our opportunities for growth or limit our opportunities for getting help, either for ourselves or maybe for a loved one. And so it's sort of like a great strength and also a great weakness in some other aspects sometimes. What gets in the way also is unmet needs. So it's hard to go to therapy and start working on like maybe emotional or psychological aspects if we don't have enough money, or we feel exhausted and it's really hard to get our schoolwork done and take care of the family and do this whole laundry list of things. In addition, feelings of embarrassment, like feeling like embarrassed to talk about the things I'm struggling with, or like if I was stronger, I would just I wouldn't be feeling this way, which we know is often not true, but it is how people feel. And speaking to what a relative stranger sometimes can feel really uncomfortable, talking about really personal things can feel embarrassing. And a perception of weakness. So again, there's the fear that the concern very often that if I do admit or if I do acknowledge that there's something here and I do reach out for help, that would be indicative of weakness. When very often what we find is that that's sort of a really big, courageous step to take. It's uncomfortable to do that because that discomfort is sort of indicating to us that that's uh, brave, right? So, this is a brief YouTube video that I'd love to share. I really liked hearing this man's testimony, of what he had experienced, um, in sort of like the self-reliance and the difficulty treatment seeking. There's always an ad. Give me one moment.
While I was in the military, I experienced a couple different physical injuries that altered who I was and my capabilities physically.
Are you able to see the screen, Charlie? No? Give me one second. Technology.
Gender.
Okay, I think it won't let me share the video on my screen for whatever
Okay.
reason. Do we think we should, it's a little under 5 minutes. Should I just play the audio?
We can also put the link with it too. Like maybe put the link in the chat or
Sure. Yeah. yeah, maybe I'll like put the link in the chat and like people can watch it alongside, maybe muted. Is that what you mean?
Or later, either one,
Later.
whichever. And the other thing is we couldn't see it, but we could hear it. So we could hear the guy.
Yeah, why don't I just play it out loud then?
There you go.
You don't necessarily have to see him, I guess.
And if we wanted to, we could. We have the link.
Military, experienced a couple different physical injuries that altered who I was and my capabilities physically, which in turn started affecting my mental health. And it started really, really tearing me down to the point where I wrote a suicide note. I wrote my plan. My name is Ryan Shannon. I'm a technical training instructor by trade. I'm a veteran myself, and I'm also the director of Project Red Team, which focuses on proactive mental health education and suicide prevention for veterans, first responders, and then their families and support networks. I looked at myself as a large burden on my family. This isn't the guy my wife married. He's very different than that person. And I had two tiny boys who didn't have a strong dad in my eyes at that point. The plan 180'd on me pretty hard, but I really wish I would have asked for help a lot sooner and I would never have gotten to that point.
I'd say we're facing a kind of a twin struggle in mental health right now. The first crisis is the stigma around seeking help, around talking to our friends and family about our depression, our anxiety, our anxious thoughts, our panic. So the silence and the stigma, I'd say, is our first crisis. The second crisis is access to care. Even when people have health insurance, psychotherapy and psychiatric services can be really expensive.
I had psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and so on and so forth. And then I got medically retired and sent home back to my home of record, which was here in Illinois. But the problem there is you are now going from your active duty to a veteran status, and my care did not follow me. It didn't come back to the VA here. I had to go and start at square one again. When I found myself in the dark space that I was in, I had no tools to fight back.
There just aren't enough providers out there. I've increased my caseload by about 25%, and over the last year have been turning away clients because I don't have the space. And hearing from colleagues that the case is the same for them. And we do know that there's a national shortage of psychiatric care, and those are the individuals who can prescribe antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers. So we're also having a really hard time as therapists finding psychiatrists to refer our clients to who need medication evaluations. And what we want to see is those people, when they start to have a feeling of, I'm not great today, reach out, come see a therapist. That's when to go see a therapist. Don't wait until you have a huge relationship struggle or you're thinking of suicide. Catch it early.
I was in the mindset that there's a lot of people who have worse stuff going on in their lives. There's people out serving in combat zones and things like that. So my stuff's okay. Just push it to the back and keep moving forward. It was hard to ask for help. I never really did. Stigma, man, it's something we talk about a whole lot, but I'm a guy. I'm in the military. I'm supposed to be this tough warrior type person, and we don't ask for help for things like that. We get through it. We rub some dirt on it and move forward.
There is still quite a stigma and a secrecy around mental health struggles. Nobody is calling off work for feeling depressed or anxious, but they will call off work for feeling ill or having a headache. And I think that's because in our culture, it's not okay to show any kind of vulnerability or weakness. People don't want to be labeled as the guy or the girl that is too anxious to come into work for the big meeting. We need to have really open and honest conversations about vulnerability and failure as normal. It's a normal part of life.
We think we have to take these journeys on our own, when in reality, there's a ton of people out there that are telling their stories and lighting that pathway to help. And the more people speaking up about it, the more of that path gets illuminated, the easier it is for us to walk down and together. The day I chose not to kill myself was the day that I really started fulfilling the potential that I was supposed to fill. It made me a better dad, a better husband, just a better person. You're not alone though. There's a lot of people like me out there.
Right. Thank you all for bearing with me while we figured out technology. So I really appreciated his perspective, and I thought it was helpful to hear from just from a veteran's voice, his own experiences with suicidal thoughts. All right, so this next piece that I'd like to get into is what exactly is therapy? I think there's a lot of question marks often when we haven't experienced therapy. So therapy is when we apply like empirical or scientifically backed procedures to work with someone who would like to develop healthier habits. Those habits may be like, I'd like to improve my sleep, or I'd like to not yell at my partner when I get really frustrated, or I'd like to stop feeling so anxious when I have to go in to do this. And so there's different types of, it is very heavily scientifically supported. And there's a couple of different types of therapists, like two very broad categories. There's insight-focused therapy. So that's primarily focused on like gaining self-awareness, understanding how like your past experiences, past relationships, other types of thoughts and feelings are impacting your present behavior and your present emotional patterns. So it really focuses on like the root causes of like what got you here, what impacted you. Action-oriented therapy, I think on the other hand, which I think just looking at this, I feel like given military culture, I feel like it'd be like, ah, yes, that one. It emphasizes learning and practicing specific coping strategies. So learning like behavioral skills to manage thoughts or emotions or behaviors more effectively. Lots of like skill-based work. So it's like, okay, here I am. What do I do about it? So in general, I think it's important to note that many therapists use a blend of both. I think there's no therapist that's just exclusively one. But in general, there's typically like clinicians will practice mostly from one, but will typically blend in both. Some examples of action-oriented therapy, I gave a couple examples. That would be cognitive behavioral therapy, which we call CBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, or solution-focused therapy. This is just in case you're ever looking, you run into these terms, you sort of know more about what that is. Insight-oriented could be like humanistic or psychodynamic therapy. And the other piece of therapy is that it takes time and commitment. So it's not something that's easily done in one session and sort of like a check mark. Oftentimes it requires a lot of like work to put in. And at the same time, it can have really great outcomes on well-being. So it's sort of work that's worth it in many ways. I do want to note that therapy is not one size fits all. So more intense symptoms may take longer to treat, and that can be sort of a frustrating thing to experience. In addition, buy-in is really important. So buy-in is like the willingness to engage in the process, or like the buy-in to the therapy process to try the weird or new or the risky thing that is going to therapy. And so it's important to be like, all right, let me give this a good, genuine try. In terms of like predicting outcomes, there's a lot of research that says that like buy-in is a predictor of better outcomes. And the last bit is therapist-client fit and relationship is really important. So when we talk about fit, we're talking about how you interact with the client, and do you feel, how you interact with the therapist. So are we feeling comfortable with the therapist? Are we feeling like understood? We can be vulnerable. Do we feel like the things that they talk about are actually helpful? And do we feel like we can have a conversation with them about things that aren't helpful? Sometimes it takes a minute to find a good fit, and that's okay. That's kind of the process. You can still have effective therapy with a provider that you don't feel a perfect fit with. But sometimes if you are like, I don't know if this therapy thing is working for me. Sometimes it might just be that the fit is off with a therapist, and it can be worth it to spend some time and like really understand that therapist's like orientation, or like, are they insight oriented, action oriented, really understanding things that might be impacting that sort of reaction of, I don't know if this is working for me. So how can therapy be helpful? Oftentimes it's not just symptom reduction. We don't necessarily are looking entirely to just reduce symptoms of PTSD or just reduce symptoms of depression or anxiety. It can also focus on like readjustment and role transition. So as we talked about how student veterans struggle a lot with the transition into civilian life. So that could be something that could be a topic to talk about. Any type of life stressors, relationship challenges, personal growth or self-improvement. Maybe you just want to get better at talking about your feelings with your partner, or maybe you just want to learn how to, maybe you really struggle to, you procrastinate often and you want to do better at that. That could be something that we sort of talk about in treatment. Improving habits, of course, and it could also be a supportive place to process past or current experiences. I wanted to add a little blurb about group counseling. I remember every time I suggested this to any veteran I worked with at the VA, they were like, no, because they didn't want to talk about their things in a group setting. Group counseling can be really effective though, because you can see that other people have shared experiences with you. It can really normalize the fact that you're going through something. Here are a bunch of other people going through the same thing. It feels good to feel less alone. So it can feel like it's definitely scary, and maybe it's not the first step, but I often encourage people to have an open mind, and maybe at some point they do grow comfortable towards it because it can be really powerful. Okay, so accessing care. So this portion is going to be about a brief walkthrough of how to navigate each resource. I'll briefly walk through each of these. So first off is the William & Mary College Counseling Center. The College Counseling Center offers individual counseling to currently enrolled William & Mary students for typically about a semester's worth of time. And we also offer group counseling. So we also offer assistance with referring out into the community if you would like a provider that's like, I mean, oftentimes lots of our like first year students need help like finding someone within walking distance to campus. So maybe if you have like a friend or a family friend that's looking at a provider within walking distance of campus, like we could of course help find someone for them. And we typically set up a consultation appointment with people who are interested in accessing care at the counseling center, and then we'll help determine appropriate next steps. So let me just show you very briefly about how that website looks. Okay, so this is the William & Mary College Counseling Center appointment. And here you can see we offer urgent appointments, so you can come to the counseling center during our standard hours. We also have after hours on call clinicians also available. We also can do referrals to psychiatric services or like assessment, like if you would like to get assessed for ADHD or those sorts of things. We can have a chat about that as well. And we also offer a private space on campus. So if someone, for example, lives in the dorms and they don't feel comfortable, like maybe they can only do telehealth for whatever reason, or telehealth is like virtual therapy. Maybe they can do telehealth for whatever reason, but they don't have like a safe space, like their roommate is home or they share a dorm with someone. We have private spaces at the counseling center that someone can come in and reserve for purposes of going to teletherapy. So the next one on the list is Timely Care. And I don't entirely know if Timely Care, perfect. So Timely Care is available to all students and actually all full-time faculty. Timely Care offers 12 free virtual sessions with a provider. And you can filter for specific issues. For example, like anxiety, where you can filter for specific demographics of your therapist. If you're looking for someone who's maybe another male therapist, that could be something that you could look up, that you could select. And those 12 free sessions roll over in August, meaning that they restart in August. I'm not entirely sure of the how those roll over for faculty. I know that for students, they roll over in August. So the next one I'd like to bring up is also the Student Health Center on campus. If you're interested in taking any sort of medication, like an antidepressant, they do offer like consultations where you can chat with them about potentially any sort of like anxiety issues or depression issues that you may be struggling with, and they can prescribe that straight from the Student Health Center. So that would be another option. And the Student Health Center is right underneath the Counseling Center. They're both in the McLeod building. So this next piece is RINSE, which is something that we use often at the Counseling Center. So this is our Counseling Center referral service. This is how we as counselors can find providers in the area. This is specific to William and Mary. So it wouldn't really work if you're living in like Virginia Beach or Newport News or something. But ideally, as a disclaimer, this isn't endorsed by William and Mary College Counseling Center. This is just a resource that we have. So we can search for a provider here, and you can sort of enter what you're looking for. So for example, maybe you're interested in working through depression. You can select that here. You can select language spoken, provider's racial and ethnic identity, if that's something that matters to you, gender identity, the insurance accepted. So we could say like TRICARE. And then any other services they offer, like maybe individuals, couples, family groups, anything like that. The age group. So you can even select children, adolescents. So of course you'd have to live in like the Williamsburg area because most of these are based out of that. But I think that there are some that are like a little bit spanning further. And then here within walking distance of campus, sliding scale, low cost, accepting new clients. So I should have done this beforehand. What is William and Mary's zip code? 23320.
187.
23187. There we go. So we get a bunch of names here. And basically, yeah, it looks like there's a lot in Williamsburg. There are some in Newport News. So this is another resource here, and you can sort of click on each person, see a little background about them, what they specialize in, what they're good at, what insurance they take, and just all those answers that with all those filters we just looked at, that it'll answer all of those details. And then of course their contact information. So you can just send them an email and say, hey, are you taking new clients? I'd love to, are you doing telehealth or in person? Those sorts of questions that you may want to know in terms of like how you would like to meet with them. Then this next little bit is of course, there's also the VA. I wanted to name that. You could always go to the VA for mental health treatment, although wait lists are kind of long. I would say they're much longer than going to a community provider. So if the need is sort of more immediate or urgent, I would recommend going to a community provider in that sense, or in the sense that if you want to avoid for a wait list, then the community provider might be a better choice. And then the next bit that I'd like to highlight is Psychology Today. So Psychology Today is very often how we find therapists. You could just Google it right here, Psychology Today, find a therapist. And let's put in 23817 187.
187. Our Sublime fans will be able to remember that easier than others.
I live in Norfolk, so that's not my zip code. But basically you just put in the zip code here and it'll pop up a bunch of therapists. So here we can also filter by issues. So whether that be like, let's say trauma and PTSD, it'll filter that out for you. We can also select by insurance, and TRICARE is on there. The gender of your therapist, the types of therapy. So kind of a long list here. It can feel a little overwhelming. I typically just leave it blank. Age group. So if you're looking for something for like your kids or like a teenager, you could also look at that. the price for how much it would cost per session, and these are some additional like faith, language, sexuality, ethnicity served, some more specifics. So in terms of like looking for a veteran therapist specifically, there's a lot of student veterans who may have talked about like, I want to see a veteran therapist specifically because I want them to understand like the culture of the military, and I want them to understand, I don't want to have to provide all this background information on what it is to be in the military. Research shows that it's not necessarily super important to have like a perfect demographic match between you and your therapist. But if it's something that makes you feel more comfortable, or if it's something that helps get your foot in the door, then that's totally okay too. So what you do, this is my workaround that I'm teaching you all today, is that you search on Google the same thing, but you just search veterans therapist and then add in your zip code. And here you'll see that it's highlighted things like military here, military, this person is a veteran herself. I'm a military spouse. This person works with active duty military spouses, members of the National Guard. So that's sort of like a workaround for finding people that are specifically might like work with veterans. I also noticed that it's just doing Virginia broadly. Something that can be helpful is if you're open to telehealth or virtual telehealth, you don't necessarily need to see someone who is immediately in your area. When someone is licensed, they can practice in the entire state that they're licensed in. So if someone, for example, lives in like Charlottesville, but they do telehealth, you could see them through telehealth as long as they're licensed in your state. So if you run into someone from like Norfolk or Chesapeake, but you live in Williamsburg, if you are interested in telehealth, you could still see them if they're okay with it. So that's another little bit to know. Right here is also, you can switch from therapists to looking at online therapy, psychiatrists, treatment centers, and support groups. So that's another option if you want to expand that search and look into like these more broad, like searches. Okay. So let me just go back here. So that's everything. I included the crisis number at the bottom again. And then these are just crisis resources. So if you or someone you know or someone you love ever needs access, you might even like want to take a picture of this in case you want to have like a list of these. This is all just the crisis lifelines and hotlines that we have, including police department, counseling center. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has a phone number, and they also have chat services in case someone doesn't actually want to actually talk to someone. There's a crisis text line. So this is another resource. And this is a link that I'm going to send in the chat. This was a very helpful web page by the American Psychological Association that goes over everything therapy. Like, what is it? When should you consider it for yourself? What are the different kinds? So it's pretty lengthy. I think it could be a good read if you're interested in learning more, or maybe it's a resource that you could share with a loved one. I'll send that in the chat here. And whenever the Zoom session ends, obviously those will disappear. So if you want to save that link, you'll have to click it and like star it or something on your own computer. But yeah, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. Are there any sort of questions or comments or anything else that we can answer for you?
So my question is, if somebody signs up for counseling, signs up for therapy, and has a bad experience, is
Mhm.
that it? Or is it possible that that's just a bad match and they should try somebody else or try for maybe somebody with a different area of expertise? I just have had that experience myself personally. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that about maybe the different approaches and that sort of thing for counseling and therapy.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think that that's a common experience that people have. Unfortunately, there is the quality of training is not the same across different training programs and those sorts of things. And so sometimes people might not get adequate training in providing therapy. That has also been my experience. I definitely have had a therapist where I felt huge disconnection with that person. And they said some things that were actually harmful in some ways. And so I can totally resonate with that. And I do think it happens. I think that oftentimes it is a fit thing where like sometimes we have to look for someone else. Sometimes it can be helpful on the Psychology Today page, for example, to see like what they practice from. So you can sort of get an idea of like, is this action oriented or is this like process oriented or like insight oriented? Sometimes there's a lot of difficulty with like insight oriented work because it can feel kind of slow or um like we're not like really focusing on the past that feels difficult or uncomfortable to do or maybe not helpful. With more action oriented things, sometimes people have complaints that like, but I want to like process this thing that happened to me. We're not talking that much about it. So it can definitely be fit. Sometimes it also is like an indication of maybe I am not like ready yet, or maybe um I'm not necessarily like ready to like talk about things. Like sometimes people have bad experience because they're not feeling ready to go to therapy. I mean, it is a thing where you do have to feel a certain level of readiness and preparation and willingness to do the work. But I would say oftentimes it's probably more likely a fit situation, given that therapists are also human and their own perspectives on what therapy is and how it works are going to differ person to person. So I would just recommend doing a little bit more research. You're also well within your rights to reaching out to the therapist and asking like, what's your orientation or like what sort of interventions do you typically practice from? Just to get to know a bit more about their style to see if they're a good fit. Um, and then just like you can always just Google that information or reach out to someone and ask, reach out to the counseling center and ask. Like that's okay. But I would say it's probably fit related. Yeah.
Totally agree. I think it's my fault in every case. Just kidding, but no, it's a match. Not everybody is exactly compatible. Totally agree.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
Right. First of all, what a fantastic briefing. I don't think you left anything uncovered.
Thank you.
Couple things that occurred to me, and I don't know that there's some great answers for this, but my sense is that over the last decade or maybe 2 decades, the concept of anxiety and people feeling anxious has taken on a whole different meaning than it did not that many years. In fact, it's kind of like, who isn't anxious?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone seems to be anxious about a lot of things at all times. So I'm not really sure where the dividing line is before it becomes something of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. And you're absolutely right that like our culture has shifted in a way where we talk a lot more about anxiety and how it impacts us. Oftentimes, what we look at is how it's impacting our functioning. So, is it preventing us from being able to do the things that we want to do or need to do? Is it stopping us from doing the presentation? Like, I had anxiety going into this presentation today, and yet I'm here. And so, that anxiety, I would say, is sort of functional. So, oftentimes, it's normal and adaptive to have anxiety. It can protect us from different things, it can make sure that we are prepared for our presentations. And sometimes for some people, it goes beyond that and it enters like the other side of the spectrum where it becomes debilitating. Like they feel so anxious that they can't get to the presentation, or it stops them from saying the thing that they want to say, or maybe it stops them from, I don't know, going to the doctor because they fear the dentist so bad, those sorts of things. So when it comes to like differentiating between what's like a healthy amount of anxiety and what's problematic, we typically look at how it's impacting functioning.
Is the generally speaking, is the approach for an individual who has a tendency to be more anxious than not, or more often, is it to get them to the point where they aren't as anxious, or is it just give them a coping skill that says, okay, you recognize what's going on, but you still have to do this. I mean, there are some opportunities for people to kind of bail out because of the anxiety, but that's not always true. So, I mean, is that the goal then? Is to, push, how do people push through the anxiety to do the things they need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think there's going to be a lot of different perspectives on this because lots of different therapists have different orientations. I think from my perspective, oftentimes we sort of want to understand what that anxiety is doing for you, like what's it protecting you from, or why is it coming up? Um, and then how can we work with it to get you to do what you maybe want to do or like fulfill the requirements you want to fulfill. So sometimes that is sort of like pushing past it or pushing through with it while using a coping skill. um and what we find over time is that that anxiety might be less intense or less strong because we sort of have that like exposure to like, okay, this sucked, but I got through it. I feel more confident in my ability to get through it. And so that the reactivity or like your body's signals that like this is really anxious, like this is really anxiety inducing, can sort of reduce over time with treatment. For some other therapists, they might focus a lot on like the background of like, why is this causing anxiety? What have you experienced in your life that has created this association between this situation and extreme anxiety,
Mm.
debilitating anxiety? And sometimes having that insight or like understanding that that's what's happening, can give us a new perspective when it happens of like, oh yeah, this I'm anxious right now because XYZ. Let's work through that, right? So there's a couple of different ways to treat it. There's not a one size fits all there. That's a great question.
Can I ask two more?
Sure.
Charlie, can I ask two more? He'll cut me off, I know. He will.
I'll cut you off if
Um,
you ask a third one, I swear.
yeah. This is just a logistical question that I haven't had to face it before, but the idea that if an individual is feeling whatever they're feeling when they wake up, and they just know it's not going to be a good day for them, and it's enough to make them uh, need to feel like they need to go get some help on that.
Mhm.
How does that match up with the actual logistics of getting hold of a therapist to go see them? So, I mean, if the person wakes up feeling like this is a really crappy day, I'm not sure how I'm going to get through it by myself, and they
Mhm.
make the phone call, and the next appointment that's available is 3 weeks from now.
Mhm.
It basically seems like uh, a tough thing to recommend to people that that's the solution when I'm not sure the logistics actually match up.
Sure. Yeah. So what you're describing of the sense of like waking up and feeling really, really bad seems like something like with the extent of the severity of how severe that would be maybe something that's more like a crisis situation where we would maybe recommend like calling one of those lifelines or hotlines or reaching out to a friend. Oftentimes what we do in therapy where it's like you meet once a week or once every 2 weeks, the goal is not to like have a support for you the moment that you feel stressed. It's more of to have resources for you when you do feel stressed. When you do wake up and you do feel that way, you're like, okay, I know these things. I can practice these tools that I learned in therapy last week. It's going to suck. I'm going to get through it. And I'm going to bring this into therapy next week. And I'm going to say, here's what my Friday looked like. I woke up feeling XYZ type of way. I was thinking this. I did this. And then in therapy, we can maybe talk about what was the chain of events, what made things worse, what made things better. So to sort of like prevent it from happening in the future, or maybe make it less intense in the future. So it's sort of like there's a lot of space in between. But when someone has something that's like, I wake up today, I'm feeling really crappy, it's not necessarily the role of therapy to intervene in that moment, but more so to provide you with the skills to, when that moment happens, to move through it.
Okay, thanks. Charlie, do I still have time for one more? Okay, one more. One thing that jumped out at me on the slide, I don't remember what slide number it was, but it had a list of things that kind of indicated how people who had been in the military or were used to the military or had a sense of more structure, or generally had a set of things or maybe a little more predictable for them, as opposed to the point where they get out. I have to think about that a while. I mean, I know that that's kind of the stereotype of military that's very structured, but I don't know that I fully buy into that. Particularly, a lot of the people that, you know, the more they advance in the ranks, I mean, other than putting a uniform on them in the morning and driving through the gate, after that, I'm not sure their day is structured at all. What they actually probably have learned is how to deal with things falling apart, as opposed to living with a structure. Because, you know, no, as they say, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and no morning starts out structured past about 8:05. But the one thing that I was kind of curious about that I thought might have been on that list, as I guess a tool or an advantage that the veterans have, is perhaps a greater sense of trust in their colleagues or the people around them, which I think that might be one of the things that changes when they get out, at least anecdotally over the decade or so that I've been here and Charlie's been here. I've heard more than a few people say that. It's not that they distrust who's around them, but they don't necessarily trust them either. They don't greet people with I know who you are, I know what you're all about. Even if we've never met before, I know I can count on you. And then when that goes away, I think that's as big a factor for the change from one lifestyle to the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're losing a whole community essentially.
Yeah, you're losing a whole community, and you're losing a whole bunch of things frankly, you take for granted. I mean, you know, the trust that's kind of inherent and built in. You don't have to think about it all day long because it's just there.
Mhm.
And I think for a lot of the students, again, they don't have a reason to distrust people, but they don't have an inherent trust either. And, you know, there's an energy cost to that. You know, if everything you meet, every conversation you have, there's a little bit of your time and effort that's having to go into weighing the conversation. You know, how much do I buy this or not?
Yeah.
Where in the military, it didn't take quite that much energy.
Definitely. That's a really great perspective. And I think that you're right on the money. I mean, that also aligns with a lot of like research on how it can feel like you have this trusted group of individuals you're around, and then you leave that space, and that can contribute to those feelings of isolation or disconnectedness from peers and faculty. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm done, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, I think every student veteran has a story about their group project. Every single one, without fail. First one, last one, most recent one. There's a trust component that everyone can report for sure. It's a thing.
Okay. Anything else? Any final thoughts? All right.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, this was a pleasure. Thank you all for being here tonight. And let me know, please reach out if you have any additional questions or follow-ups. And Charlie, I will send you the recording so you can disseminate it to the people that need it.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolina. This is great.
Thank you. All right.